I'm just going to talk about AP debate and strategy. Well, AP debate strategy, that is. I first want to briefly talk about what AP strategy is, because I think there's a difference between the content component of the case and the strategy component of the case. So there are like content components to a case, which is like the things that we typically think about during prep. Like, what is our definition going to be? What is our model going to be? Like, what is our argument 1, 2, 3? And during the debate, it's things like, okay, they had this argument, so what am I going to rebut? So these are just components of the case where you can decide something is a content component if it was not a debate and a back and forth, and you were writing a paper supporting this. Would this still be included? Then if it is still going to be included, probably it is a content component. But debate is not just about the contents that you are operating with. It's also about the strategy that comes with it. So strategy is when you ask yourself the question, given that our team is going to say these particular things, like we're going to run with this definition, this model, and these arguments, how do we make the things that we say round winning? Because you could have the best argument in the world, and if the other team is just like, but that's irrelevant, like you're probably not going to win. So strategy is about how you maneuver those things. So it's about stuff like stance and burdens. It's about stuff like how your arguments and rebuttals interact. And finally, it's about framing and angling. So I'm going to talk about these kinds of things. Obviously, these things are less complete when you have an incomplete argument or if the content component is not very strong. So they interact somewhat, and I will talk about those things too. But I will mainly be talking about the strategy. First things first. So a stance is like, if you think about it, it's basic, but it's so basic that sometimes we kind of miss doing it. So I think there's 3 very important questions that you need to ask yourselves during prep. And the first is, what are you willing to defend? That is, the motion is sometimes vague and sometimes like it's unclear what specific scenario the motion is talking about. So it's asking you to define in not dictionary terms, but in like layperson terms or examples, what exactly you are willing to defend. I'll talk about this more later on with an example. Like all of these things would probably help with like an actual motion. The second thing is positioning or parallels. So I think it's fairly common for people to be asking POIs to the other side, being like, oh, according to this principle, are you also okay with X other thing that sounds morally egregious? So it's stuff like, we are okay with this, but we are not okay with this. It's about drawing the line on what kinds of things you are okay with defending. And the final thing to ask yourself when it comes to stance is to ask yourself, what is the priority? Because especially in good debates, it is impossible to win everything, unfortunately. Because if you were winning everything, then presumably like the debate is after the first 2 speakers and like, the whip doesn't have to speak. But that's not how things usually work, given that both teams are quite good. So in those instances, what arguments are you winning on? And what arguments do you intend to be winning on that are stronger for your side? And why are those more important than the arguments of the other side? I think that has to be established during prep time to make things easier, because I think especially in AP debate with prep time being so long, I think it really is a competition of who gets to the crux of the debate as fast as possible. And the slower you are in getting to the crux, the more likely you are gonna, lose the debate. But I want to talk about this more with examples. So for instance, let's say the motion is, this house opposes left-wing media using mockery to cover the far right, and you're like on proposition or government or whatever else they call the side that supports the motion. Like the 3 questions you would ask are, 1, what are you willing to defend? And here's where the debate might get like a bit vague, especially because it's unclear like what mockery is. Because like you could give a dictionary definition of mockery, but that's not going to help anyone in the round like understand what exactly you are debating about. So I think in the perspective of a government, it would be saying things like, we would prefer if shows like The Daily Show or Last Week Tonight, which are both like American shows that make fun of Trump and the Republican Party, I guess, like those shows did not exist. And we would prefer if mainstream media and leftist groups did not make fun of one, the intelligence of the far right, and two, the appearance of far right politicians, because those are fairly common things that happen, as in like people make fun of like Trump for being like orange. Like that's mockery. That's not really substantive criticism. So I think those are the things that you have to lay out to both the adjudicator and the other team, that this is what the debate is going to be about. Obviously, when doing this, it is helpful to mention things that are better for your side. That is, like, it is probably not a very good thing for democracy that people are making fun of the appearance of politicians, as opposed to like The Daily Show or Last Week Tonight, which does offer some substantive criticism. So it's important to highlight the parts that are good for your side while mentioning the wide range of things that you are going to debate about. The second thing is positioning or parallels. This is also important in this debate because the line for where you draw the mockery is unclear, and oftentimes the easiest op argument in this debate is stuff like, oh, but you need like a way to criticize, or you need a way to investigate into the far right. So I think it's something along the lines of where you clearly lay out from the first proposition speaker that you are okay with things like neutral journalism, as long as and you are okay with journalism that explicitly criticizes the far right, whether it be for their methods or their substance. You're also okay with things like investigative journalism into far right groups, but you're not okay with mocking the far right for traits that are out of their control, as well as mocking their stance without offering like a substantive criticism. Like, it's not okay to laugh at them, basically. So I think that kind of positioning makes it very clear what you guys are okay with and what you are not okay with, and makes the debate much, much less muddled, which is very helpful, especially for debates like these. And the final thing you have to ask yourself is, what exactly is the trade-offs? And here's where you think a bit about what the opposition is probably going to say. So I think, especially if your proposition, the main I guess, push of your case is probably that you need to restore some kind of trust in media. And you can say, you can even preemptively say that this is our priority, that we think this is more important than like marginally increased criticism of the far right or marginally increased support of the left. You can also talk about how you're more likely to protect marginalized groups, if that's an argument. But I think it's important to know what you are going to win on and why that is more important than what you think the opposition is probably going to win on. Obviously, opposition teams may not operate the way you expect them to operate, and they might have some weird arguments, or they might have some like arguments that want the exact same goals as you. In that case, like, it doesn't matter. You're still winning on the basis of you're proving the metric that you have set out. So this is the stance part. And I think the important thing about the stance is, I think a lot of debaters, particularly when they're starting out, do that thing where for the first 30 minutes of prep, you think of arguments and you develop arguments. And then the stance is like something that develops throughout the debate as the opposition team questions you further. And you're like, yes, I probably need to think of an answer to that. That's not bad as long as you're answering the questions. But what's much, much more cleaner is if you have all of these answers during prep and you lay it out at the first minute of your speech so that it's very, very clear what you guys are defending. That was the stance part of this lecture. Moving on to burdens. Burdens are also kind of like, I guess the clue is in the name, in the sense that it's like, what is your burden and what is the other team's burden? Basically, it's just two simple things. The first is, what does your team need to prove in order to win the debate? And the second thing is like, what does the opposing team need to prove in order to win the debate? Yeah, the more important question actually is how to have good burdens, because like, I think we are often taught that we need to have burdens, and therefore we just have them for the sake of having them. Kind of like we have, I don't know, different things in our speech for the sake of having them. That's not very helpful. I think burdens are very important and very easily utilizable. So how to do burdens. The first thing is, don't say obvious things. And I tell this to even the most like advanced debaters, i.e. world schools kids, but like people sometimes say stuff like, our burden is to prove that this is principally justified and good, and their burden is to prove that this is like unjustified and bad. Like, obviously that is the case, right? So I think when coming up with burdens, it's important to ask yourself, like, would someone think this is kind of granted? Like, would everyone agree to this burden? And if that is the case, and if it sounds very, very obvious, you probably should not say that because it's just wasting time. Like, it's not going to do you any damage. But given that speaking time is one of the most rarest resources in debate, it is best to utilize those resources for other things. So when coming up with burdens, you have to think about what your side has to prove and be ready to defend it. So ask yourself in prep, like, what do we need to establish to win the round? So for instance, if the motion is like, this house would mandate all workers to join labor unions, probably you need to prove that like there is some kind of problem with labor unions in the status quo. You probably need to prove that you fix that problem by mandating all workers. And you probably need to prove that, sure, not every single worker will be happy as a result of this, but that the vast majority of workers will be better off when they are mandated to join labor unions. And if you come up with these burdens, it's also very, very important to either mention them, but also just be cognizant of them, because good opposing teams will push burdens on you and say, oh, what government needs to prove in this debate is that every single worker will be better off as a result of this. Like, that's a bit unreasonable. And especially if you've talked about it in prep, that your burden is not to prove that every single worker will be better off, but that most workers will be better off than where they currently are, then probably it's like easier to push back. And you know that you can just be like, that like opposition is pushing an unfair burden onto us. So I think what's more important when thinking of your burden is, one, just ask yourself in prep, what do we need to establish? Two, in prep, once you know what you need to establish, you probably should establish those things, because like you need to prove those things to win the round. And finally, when the other side is being unreasonable in terms of what you need to prove in the round, please call them out on it. Don't defend something that you're not supposed to defend, because a bunch of people, even like good debaters, in my opinion, are like, we'll bite the bullet. Like, no, don't bite the bullet. Like, biting the bullet might kill you sometimes. So it's important to establish like where the clear grounds are. The final thing is you need to push the other side on what they have to prove. And here's where it's okay to be unfair. Like, if you were just saying, oh, their burden is to prove that this is like not, this is unjustified and bad. Like, sure, they probably thought of those things in prep. Like, they probably will prove those things. So it's kind of like, there's no point in saying that. So I think when you push burdens, it's important to be like, first, you need to make them engage with the best case scenario that your team can accomplish. So presumably during prep, your team has a goal. So just be like, given this goal, why is status quo like fulfilling this goal or something? So I think like asking them to be like, to defend why the current system is working in accomplishing that goal, or why that goal is like not important at all, is something that is helpful. And secondly, I think it's actually important to be detailed in terms of burden pushing. So you probably have some examples in your case or some context that you want to talk about more than others. So it's important to make them engage in context and examples that are the most helpful for your team, because it'll make you sound bad. Oh, and please ignore the don't be rude thing. That was not for this lecture. Yeah. Moving on. The second portion of this is about how arguments and rebuttals interact. So yeah, and here's where I want to once again reiterate that it's not just about having an argument for the sake of having an argument, because I think people, and even myself, honestly, have a tendency to be like, okay, we need 3 arguments. What is argument 1? What is argument 2? And what is argument 3? But we never really think about the big picture. And the same goes for rebuttal. And I think it manifests in a bit of a different way for rebuttal. I think for rebuttal, it's like, okay, they said this, we need to rebut to this, and then we need to rebut to the second argument, and then we need to rebut to the third argument, which is like fine if you cover everything. It's just speaking time is a super limited resource in debating. Like, I think like especially at moderate levels, like people go over time all the time. And the reason for that is because speaking time is a limited resource. So rather than thinking of rebuttal in terms of like, I need to rebut every single thing, I think it's also important to think about like what actually has to be rebutted in order for us to win the round. So, but that being said, arguments and rebuttals have to be complete, as in like, it's not just sufficient to have like a sentence as an argument, because that's not going to work. So what I'm trying to get at is you need to work on completing the arguments before doing any kind of strategic maneuvering or burden pushing. Because if you do strategic maneuvering or burden pushing before you complete the arguments, you're actually setting up a trap for yourself, because the other side is going to be like, okay, they weighed this as the most important thing in the round, but they actually didn't prove it, so they are actually losing. So that can be harmful for your team. So it's always argument completion first, and then strategic maneuvering. But I'm not saying that this is the order that you should work through during prep. This is the order that you should work through while you are developing as a debater. That being said, so I'm first going to talk about very, very briefly about argument completion, because I find that a lot of debaters have taglines, but they don't complete their argument. So in order for something to be a complete argument, it must be able to, one, stand alone, and two, it must be able to prove the point that you are proving. I'm just going to divide this into principled argumentation and pragmatic argumentation. Obviously, there are other ways to divide arguments, but I find this the simplest way in terms of what are the key components. So for principled argumentation, the first thing you should think about is, what is the thesis of this argument? As in, if you could summarize this argument into one sentence, what is that sentence? And in doing this, I think it's important to be specific and identify the principle. That is, like, never call an argument like the principle. Probably call it something like, we defend the right to do X thing, or like, we defend the government obligation to do Y thing. So like that type of thing should be the thesis of the argument. The second thing under this is a justification of why we should follow the principle, which I find missing in a lot of cases, especially when we think we are defending principles that are obvious. For instance, when we think we are defending like what democracy should look like, I think it's fairly common for people to kind of take for granted that democracy is the end all be all and the goal of everything, which may not necessarily be true, either when you're debating internationally or when there are other goals that collide with the principle that you are defending. So I think it's important to justify why we should follow that particular principle. There are three ways of going about this. The first is philosophical reasons. And this is where, like, if you studied philosophy or read philosophy books, they will be helpful. If not, go to Stanford Encyclopedia on Google and read some of those documents, and that will be helpful. But yeah, these are just like the vague things that philosophers came up with, like, I don't know, 200 years ago, maybe longer. And sometimes they're helpful. The second thing is consistency with current norms. This is the argument where you go, here are some parallels to look at in terms of what our government defends. And this is an extension of what we are already doing. So for instance, if you're debating about whether you should limit a particular kind of speech or not, then you can probably be like, a lot of governments in Western liberal democracies already have limitations on things like hate speech, because they recognize that speech is not absolutely free, and because they recognize that when speech is harmful for other people or can incite violence, that's something that ought to be protected. And then you can be like, our policy is an extension of the things that we have already been doing. The obvious response to this from the opposing side is, just because something is the way things are doesn't mean that is the way things ought to be. Yeah. So I think it's important to preempt that by saying, this is not like an is-ought fallacy, but rather this is a norm that our society views as important and has been defending for a long period of time, and therefore it would be inconsistent to go back on those norms. The final thing that people develop principles is about obligations. So it's like, what is the role of government? What is the role of society? And here, and this type of argumentation is particularly common for like actor motions, where, I mean, not all actor motions, I guess, but like either this house would motions where it is clear that the government is the one that is acting, or this house as something motions where it's clear that, like, you know what the interests of the actor are. So these are how you justify why you should follow the principle. So now you've established that you need to follow the principle. Next step, also that is missed out by people and taken for granted, is why only our side follows the principle. Because presumably if you spend like 3 minutes or two and a half minutes, I guess, proving a principle, and you stop there, and the other side is like, ah, but we satisfy that principle too, then you just did good work for the other side. I'm sorry. So you need to explain why only your side follows the principle. And this is where you probably explain like status quo is insufficient and our side is sufficient. Or conversely, if you're the side defending status quo, you say status quo is sufficient and why they are breaking that principle. The final thing to do, and this is like a bit of an extra step, like I would say an argument is complete if you did step 1, 2, 3. But a better argument would be if you weigh the principle against competing claims. So presumably you can kind of predict what the claims of the other side is going to be. So if you think the other side is going to make a completely pragmatic argumentation, then you can like easily say stuff like the principle is more important than any kind of pragmatic argumentation. A good example of this is like I think probably reparations debates, or like motions where you are arguing that minority groups or like indigenous people have a claim on some kind of property. You can be like, opposition may run arguments about how this is like a bad use of resources or how this is going to lead to bad things. We think those are less important because it's not about what impacts you're going to have as a result of ownership. It's about who owns these goods in the first place. And if you own some goods, it doesn't matter how you're going to mess around with them. That is what you deserve. So I think that kind of weighing might be helpful. The other type of weighing that is also common is like if you think their side is going to make some like principled claim, then you should probably weigh why your principle is more important than theirs. And a common example, I think, is like national security versus privacy debates. Like obviously one side will be like national security and like the good of everyone, and the other side will be like privacy is good. So I think if the other side is going to make principles that are that's my email, never mind. And if the other side is going to make principles that are very predictable, then it's probably important to also preemptively weigh against them. Moving on, key components of pragmatic argumentation. Once again, the thesis of the argument. If you could summarize this argument in one sentence, what would it be? So for the principle, it was like the name of the principle, right? I think for arguments, pragmatic argumentation, this should be the impact. Like what is the impact we're going to have on the round? Well, not on the round, but we'll have the impact in the round and in reality. But that would be the thesis of the argument. And then you need to do steps 2, 3, and 4. Step 2 is mechanism. As in, if you want X kind of impact, why is that impact going to happen? There are different ways to do this. The first is like the observation type, which is like, there's this trend in the status quo and this will continue to happen. And this is where people kind of like say things and say proper nouns and examples, and they are very helpful. So if you read consistently the news or anything or podcasts and you remember this is a relevant thing, then you can use like an observation type mechanism. The second is like incentive analysis, which is saying this actor has X incentive and acting in this way aligns with X incentive. So if you're like, I don't know, you're arguing about politicians, you could be like, politicians care naturally about re-election and therefore they are going to act in whatever way you want them to act within the context of the motion. The final thing is preemptive analysis. This is, I think, important. Obviously, op will have rebuttals. So I think it's important to be like, op may say this, but that's actually a mechanism for our side. And that just fast forwards the debate because it kind of cuts away from what the other side can say. And it's kind of like, I guess if you are prime minister, it's kind of like giving the DPM before the LO has been given, which kind of screws the LO up, in my opinion. And I think that's good. The second thing is what are the impacts, which is like, so what happens? This can be done in various ways. You could impact in terms of various kinds of actors, society, minorities, but I think for the impact portion, it's much more important that to be illustrative than analytical, because the mechanism portion will very definitely be analytical in a lot of cases because you're just like going through a list of mechanisms that will happen. The impact has to be much more illustrative, such that the judge later can be like, government was the team that wanted this thing, and it's kind of clear in their head. The final thing is comparative, because even if you have X impact, if the opposition can prove that they can get X impact but like 10% more, then you're probably going to lose, assuming X impact is a good thing. So it's kind of important to think about, why is this impact either exclusive on your side or the other side if it's a harm, or why that impact happens more of or less of under your side or their side. And here's where it's important to lay out the degree to which this impact will happen and how that compares with the other side. So please just make it a habit of saying things like, on our side X happens and on their side X does not happen because. And even if you haven't written a single thing down on your paper, you will probably think of a reason why that doesn't happen on a comparative, because there's a reason you thought of this argument, and it is that only your side can get that benefit. So I think if you make it a habit to say these kinds of things, it kind of makes it easier to establish the comparative. So 1, 2, 3, 4, that makes a complete argument, kind of. And then the fifth thing is, why do I care about this impact? Which is, it can be done in different ways. There's like, and people call this weighing. There's like absolute weighing, which is weighing that says this argument is the most important thing, regardless of all other things. One thing to keep in mind though is be very careful when you're committing to absolute weighing. Please be aware that the other team might be going for the exact same impact as your side, and if it's one of those debates, it is probably not good to do absolute weighing because it's giving them one easier way to win. Then there's like subjective weighing, which is like the best version of the other side's argument is X and our impacts are more important because Y, which is what I would normally recommend. Yeah, so those are how you complete arguments. And after your arguments have been completed, I think there are a couple of things to look at. The first is like, are these arguments consistent? And here's where you should catch tensions if there are any earlier on. It's very, very common for people to think of multiple independent arguments and then realize later on that they're not contradictory per se, but there are tensions in how you characterize things, for instance. So if you catch those earlier on, I think it's much easier and much less likely for the other team to call you out on those tensions if you just make explicit what the tiers of the argumentation are. That is, even if there are competing characterizations within different arguments that you're running, you can be like, these are the various types of actors that could exist. And in argument 1, we are going to talk about these types of actors. In argument 2, we are going to talk about these other types of actors. Or you can do stuff like, in argument 1, we're going to talk about the most likely scenario. But secondly, in argument 2, even if that doesn't happen, we're going to talk about what happens then. So it's like much easier if you're the one in control of the story of the consistency of your arguments, as opposed to the other side, because they will mock you, they will make fun of you, and they will say you're contradictory, and the judge might be like, maybe you are contradictory, and it's kind of harder to come up with a defense after that. The second thing to question is like, are they encompassing of all actors and contexts? I think this probably applies more to like BP debate, in my opinion, because like closing teams will be like, this debate is not about this actor or not about this context. But I think it's also common in AP for the other side to be like, government team got the context completely wrong. This debate doesn't happen in like already fully developed democracies because there's not much impact there. This debate actually happens in like weak democracies or like democracies that are backsliding into authoritarian regimes. So make sure that you are encompassing of all actors and contexts, or at least you know why. It is either 1, you are encompassing of all of them, or 2, you know why the ones that you are talking about are like more important than the ones that other people will talk about. And finally, know which arguments from your side are more important. That is, if you make 3 arguments, it would be very weird if all of them had equal weight. Like it would be very strange, intuitively speaking, if all 3 reasons for supporting a motion had the same level of thought. So it's important to think about which arguments are more important than others. Not just in terms of weighing in against the opponent's case, but in terms of your internal strategy. What are arguments we're more likely to win on? And think about why those arguments are important and impact an actor-wise, and decide the internal strategy there as well. A good example of this is, for instance, if you're running principled argumentation and you're already doing weighing that the principle comes over all of the pragmatic stuff in the round, then probably this argument, internal strategy wise, if you're winning this, you're winning the round because you've linked into why that's the most important thing. So I think deciding that stuff before the debate happens is important. Yeah, so now that arguments are complete, what do we do? There are a couple things that people can do. The first is you use completed arguments to beat the other side, because you can point out a couple of things, especially when debates become matter heavy. Obviously, there will be parts of the case that are not responded to. So there will be, sorry. So there will be lack of responses to particular analysis, for instance, or lack of responses to weighing in the argument. You deal with these two a bit differently. When the other side misses to respond to particular mechanisms, I think it's important for the next speaker to then highlight that mechanism and explain why that mechanism is more game-changing than most of the things that they have said, and therefore it kind of sets up a nice link into the impact. If the other side responds to the analysis but does not respond to the weighing in the argument, this is actually probably good for your side, but you need some additional analysis that rebuts their analysis, because the other side is essentially conceding this is the most important thing in the round. So you've already done that bit, but just because you prove something is the most important thing in the round doesn't mean you're winning the round. You still have to link into that thing in order to win the round. So I think doing additional work on analysis that you already have, or trying to take down their analysis there, would be important. The other thing that you should think about is you now know not how to complete an argument only, but you also know what components make up a complete argument. So it's much easier to notice when the other side's arguments are not complete. And when you notice the other side's arguments are not complete, you should make note of it and you should strategically use it. What I like to do is when I'm, flowing the speech of opponents, I like to use another color that says just very simple things like no comparative, or like no mechanism, or like no impact, stuff like that. It's also what judges do actually, but like, you know, even when you're debating, I think you should be doing it. And then you can be like, you should point this out, but it's not sufficient to just point it out, because if you say the other side doesn't have a comparative, let's say you're a leader of opposition, you say other side doesn't have a comparative, and then that's actually kind of helping the other side, because like the DPM is like, we don't have a comparative. So they come up and explain the comparative and you're like, oh, now my rebuttal is gone, which kind of sucks, right? So I think it's not just saying they don't have a comparative, you actively have to break it down for them. So you should be like, their side offers no comparative. Let's actually look at what the comparative is and explain why they comparatively do not have a benefit, so that it's much harder for the next speaker to come up and just rebuild, because now you've kind of built it for them just in a way that is beneficial for you. Same for mechanisms, just being like, they don't have mechanisms is not enough. You should be like, they don't have mechanisms. Let me give you a couple of reasons why this actually won't work. And it's just much harder for other teams to have a comeback. So I think, like, I know it's bad to think of debate as a game. Like, I know it's an educational activity, but if you want to think of debate as a game, it's about using limited resources to deplete the resources of the next speaker as much as possible. So if you are spending a minute doing this and the other speaker has to spend 4 minutes in order to rebuild, you're actively doing good. The final thing to use is framing and angling. I wrote more on this later, but it's just in the next slide. So later is like now. Yeah, the final thing is framing and reframing. Before anything, I want to give credit where credit is due. I want to thank Mai for this slide and the next one. I'm borrowing these from her. Yeah, that being said, what is framing? Framing is like an exercise showing what is the most important thing in the debate. And obviously I've mentioned bits and pieces of this up to now, but you can, like, for instance, if you're debating about, like, I guess, the war on drugs, then you can be like, you could use a narrative that says this, like, the war on drugs is a complete failure. People have been like prosecuted for things that they probably should not be in jail for, and explain the vulnerability of those actors, because usually they're like racial minorities, they're underrepresented minorities. And you can be like, the team that saves this actor or the team that helps this actor most is the team that wins the debate. So that kind of narrative, or like trying to tell judges what this debate should be judged upon and what the most important thing is framing. Framing is also about excluding things that you don't believe like matter in the round. So for instance, like if the motion is this house would only allow registered organ donors to receive organ donations, you can very easily just be like, this debate is not about those who can't donate organs due to like religious reasons, because the same people would also refuse to receive organ donations for the exact same religious reasons. So I think like trying to exclude argumentation or trying to exclude and tell the other side why their impacts are irrelevant is also a part of framing. Yeah, basically framing is like what matters and what doesn't matter in the round. And I guess we kind of naturally do this without realizing that we are doing it. As in, like, if you think your first argument should be X, presumably you think it's the most important in a round. So why don't we just make it clear to the judge and everyone else who is listening that this should be the most important thing? Yeah, so how to frame, this is also my slide. There's no exhaustive list on how to frame a debate. You're just simply like looking at the bigger picture and asking yourself, like, what will win me the debate? And which like obvious claims from the other team will distract from the main issues, and then you frame around those issues. I think I like to approach this in terms of before the debate and after, and during the debate. There's no after the debate because it's already happened. Before the debate, you should ask yourself, like, what are the arguments that we will probably win on? And you should probably give some weighing as to why those are important, as I've talked about. But during the debate, this will obviously change. And I think debate is also about a game of how much you adjust from the prep time. Obviously, it would be ideal if you could run exactly the stuff you had in prep. But given that gov teams and op teams prep in separate rooms with separate mindsets, it's kind of impossible for that to happen. So I think during the debate, it's important to ask yourself, what are we already winning on? If there is no single material that you are winning on, I'm sorry, it's not time to frame. Like it's time to be rebutting and it's time to be making arguments. But if you know that there are certain parts of the debate that you are winning on, at like whip speech or at deputy speeches, then you can be like, you can start your speech with, this is the most important thing of the round, and we are already winning on this, and then just explain the issue. So I think like framing during the debate should also adjust to what is actually happening. Yeah. And these are like different types of framing. There's like tipping point framing, which is like the urgency of the case makes it the biggest priority. I think this is particularly true for like recent motions on like health and pandemics. Like, surely, of course, there are long-term impacts, but like if people are dying right now, that probably matters more. And if the economy is entirely destructed because people are dying, that also probably matters more. There's like moral parallel framing, which is like, we care about this particular set of morals and therefore that should matter the most in the round. The final thing is like drastic problems call for drastic measures framing, which is like everything we've tried has failed and the severity of the problem can no longer be ignored, which is typically when people say stuff like all other solutions that have been tried in the status quo aren't working or won't work. Yeah. I want to talk a bit more about additional ways to weigh and frame, because I think like these are obvious things that are in the back of our heads, but unless we make it explicit, the judge will just choose a frame that they like, or like choose a frame that like seems the most intuitive. And that's bad for your side, because what if your side's framing isn't the most intuitive, you know? That would be sad. That would be like a coin toss. So here's some additional ways to frame. The first is like magnitude of the impact. And this is where you compare the severity of the harm or the benefit. So for instance, if the impact on your side is death and the impact on their side is injury, probably death is worse than injury. Just stuff like the severity of the harm is far worse or far better under your side as opposed to theirs, that level of comparison, and then being like, this means that we outweigh in the actual harm that is being done. The other thing is scope, which is the size or number of people impacted. So for instance, if their side is saving like 10 people, and if your side is saving like 1,000 people, that's probably a bigger benefit for your side. Obviously, in debate land, like it's unlikely that this is going to be like a math problem where the other side explicitly proves that they saved 10 people and your side explicitly proves that you're going to save 1,000 people. but you will probably have those intuitions about how big is the outreach of the other side and how big is the outreach of your side. And in those instances, it's kind of not that bad to put a number on it. So just saying stuff like they only save a limited set of people, which means every time we are saving like 10,000 people, they're only reaching 100 people. We think that more scope is better. That type of thing kind of just makes it clear for everyone. The third thing is like probability, the likelihood of a harm or benefit. And here's where you could just kind of completely exclude the other side's argumentation just by saying stuff like this is unlikely. So for instance, if one side is arguing that like, I don't know, what could one side be arguing? So for instance, if someone is arguing that like China will cut all economic ties with the United States, like that is extremely, extremely improbable. And once you explain why it's unlikely to happen, then all of the harms that they mentioned as to why it will happen kind of don't matter, because if something is unlikely, even if it has a really bad impact, it kind of doesn't matter. And I know this is like not how things work in math, where like the expected value is like probability times like impact. But in debate, like if you don't link into probability, then kind of hard to win on that. The next thing is duration. You could say our side is short term or long term, and their side is the opposite of that. Obviously, there is framing that is available for both things. So on one hand, you could be saying you care more about the short term impact because it's kind of like if you kind of fail on the short term, then there is no long term. This is particularly true for like death or like policy that is extremely, extremely harmful. Like if you're failing on the short run, like who cares about the long term because the harm has already been done. On the other hand, if you could mitigate the short-term harms, you could also say things like in the long run, this is all going to play out nicely. Whereas on their side, even if they have the short term, in the long run, things are going to fail massively. And therefore that's a bad thing. So I think just identifying which of these two things your side is on and explaining why one is more important than the other. Like both are obviously possible. The next thing is like reversibility. So if you are talking about a harm or benefit that cannot be undone, then presumably that is an important thing to consider in the round. And that is why your side might be winning a particular impact or not. I guess a good example of this is like, that's a good example of this. I mean, they say death is irreversible, but I feel like that's a bit too common. I think the other example is probably like abortion. Like it has a very short time frame, but like once a child is born, you cannot kill the child, obviously. You cannot get rid of the child. So I think in those instances, like talking about irreversible harm or irreversible benefits is something that is compelling. The next thing is depth of the impact. And I think recently there has been a push to use the word delta to say this. I am not a very big fan of that word, but you do you. But like I like scientifically, I think delta is a pretty good capture of what is happening, which is it's not just about the actual impact that you have, it's about the marginal impact. So let's say status quo is at 90 and you have an impact of 100. Then that like and given that your side is doing X thing as opposed to the status quo, you're probably going to lose out on that 90. So that marginal impact is 10. So it's about what is the degree of change on your side and what is the degree of change under their side. So I think it's fairly common for people to make rebuttals or make framing arguments that say their side actually claims to be having a big change and a big benefit, but it's actually not that big in comparison to what is happening in the status quo. Next thing is like vulnerability. And this is where you're making arguments that are specific to a particular group that is more vulnerable than others. So if you're making an argument that says, that talks about women or gender minorities or like racial minorities or poor individuals or like, I mean, the list goes on. But if you're making an argument about a particular set of vulnerable people, then you probably should establish like why protecting the needs of that group is more important than other arguments that may be made. So here is where you would say stuff like they have been historically marginalized, and therefore you kind of owe it to them to care about them more. Or you can say stuff like there's like decreasing marginal utility, where like these people value the goods that are given to them much more than like a privileged person would value the goods that are given to them, stuff like that, and why caring about the vulnerable actors is more important. This can also come in the form of like narratives, which I'm bad at actually, so I don't know how to do, but it's like when you paint a story and illustrate how vulnerable it is, such that you kind of make people want to care about it. Final thing is moral framing. I think we've spoken about this a bunch. So these are the ways to frame. I mean, yes, and the list goes on and on and on. It's just a simple exercise of asking yourself what is important in this round. And I think a good way of practicing this, because it might seem counterintuitive at times, is just to listen to, like, go on YouTube, type like Australs or UADC or I don't know, like previous AP tournament, listen to the prime minister and the leader of opposition, and then you think about if you were on Gov, how you would frame starting now, and if you were on Up, how you would frame starting now. Yeah. Next, integrating framing into arguments. The first thing obviously is to decide on what framing your team is using, which I've already kind of illustrated. And then there are two ways of doing this. The first is you explain that when you prove that argument, that satisfies the framing. So it's saying stuff like, we told you that environmental impacts are the most important because of like X. And in the context of environmental impacts, the argument that we gave is like has the most impact, and we most significantly reduce the harms on the environment, and therefore that satisfies the framing. I know this sounds really, really obvious, but saying it is going to make a big difference, because if you don't say it, it's unclear what impacts are the most important, why you are the side that links into that impact the most. The other thing is preemptive framing. So here's where you kind of think about what the arguments are from the other side, and you explain why your argument is already more important than theirs. So for instance, if it's like some environment debate where it's kind of clear that the opposition is going to argue about like, oh, companies are not going to like this, then you can even say stuff like the obvious response from their side is that it hurts the economy when companies have more restrictions. We think these sorts of arguments are less important than the environmental arguments, because like in the absence of a stable environment, things like reaping profits don't really matter anymore. And obviously this is kind of like very shallow framing, but like these are the kinds of things that we expect to be saying in rounds. Next is about integrating framing into rebuttals. There's a very important top level thing here that's actually very important. Oh, I said that twice. The top level thing is you need to rebut the framing that the opponents are using, because the framing of the opponents are obviously not going to be very favorable for your side. So I think especially if they push particular burdens or frame the debate in a particular way that you think you're going to lose under that framing, then you need to rebut to those things before you rebut anything else. Because if you don't respond to that, that's kind of going to cost you the round. Because even if you prove everything that your team is wanted to prove, if the framing of the other side still stands and the judge is looking at the debate from that particular point of view, it's kind of very hard to be winning. So for instance, if opposition is like, or actually if government is like, you know, also all other solutions have failed and everything in the current status quo is not working, and therefore we should do this, and that's their framing, you need to respond to that right away, being like, just because the current solutions have not been like 100% doesn't mean that we should implement like a completely radical policy that would have more harm than current solutions. It's always about a comparison of current solutions versus the solution that they want, as opposed to like everything failed, so might as well do this crazy thing. So I think that kind of response is super important. And then when you're rebutting arguments, I think two important questions are, one, does the other side meet their own framing? So if they said long-term impacts are more important, and their argument is kind of not about that. And I think this is very commonly done when people kind of think of the framing first and then develop the argument later on, like it doesn't quite match, then be very clear in pointing it out, like they're not actually meeting even the burden that they set out for themselves. But the second thing you should be doing is like adding your own framing to it, which is like, even if this argument was true, it doesn't matter because, and then insert framing or insert weighing. And I think like obviously, I kept talking about how time is like a super limited resource time is a super limited resource in debating. So people might be like, but if I have to frame all of this, then when do I actually do rebuttals? And here's where it's important to kind of choose which rebuttals you're doing and only rebut the important stuff, because saying no for the sake of saying no is kind of not going to be helpful. So I would definitely suggest like framing like shouldn't happen at the top, or like when doing rebuttals, it shouldn't be the only rebuttal, but it should be a substantial portion of the rebuttal. Final thing, prep time. I will talk about this and then we can be done. 30 minutes is a lot, especially if you have done BP. You will realize it is double the time. And so I think it's kind of important to be thinking not just about content, but also about strategy during prep. And this is like what I personally found to be effective. Like, this is not a prescription. So like, obviously different teams and different combinations of people may have different ways of doing things. That is fine. But I personally find this particular allotment to be helpful. So this is like a reference for people. 3 minutes of thinking time. And when you are thinking, think not just about our arguments, but also the other side's arguments. And yeah, basically. and like what the debate should revolve around. Because if you think about only your own arguments and then you start discussing about that, especially if you write things down during prep, that kind of locks you into that mindset where you're like, where you already believe in the stuff, and like therefore you're kind of like less likely to be critical. So I think it's important to think not just about your side, but like about the motion in general during the first 3 minutes. The 7 minutes discussion should be a discussion about the big picture. And by big picture, I don't mean like the entire, like complete big picture where you're like super distant from the debate. I think free talk is bad, but it's mostly about, one, what the argument should be, but it's also about like what the framing should be and what the other side will say and how we will interact with those. So that should be what we're discussing during the 7 minutes. What was I gonna say? I forgot what I was going to say. Moving on to the next part, which is about the 15 minutes of case. Oh, I remembered what I was going to say. In the 7 minutes discussion, like you should probably be thinking of specific impacts or specific taglines of arguments, but it's not necessary to mention mechanisms yet, because you will mention mechanisms in the next 15 minutes of case building, where you go through each argument and develop it together. And I want to emphasize each speaker should have a fairly clear idea of what the PM or LO is going to look like, because it's not just let's throw an argument to the first speaker for them to develop. That has, one, extreme high reliance on that first speaker developing the whole thing, and like just a waste of time. But secondly, it also means you're less likely to be on the same page, and I think case consistency is very important in AP. And then the final thing is 5 minutes of consolidation time, where you remind yourself of strategies. So like the general takeaway is like prep is not just about, let's think of 3 arguments, but it should be like, okay, we're going to go into this round, and after these 30 minutes, even before the debate starts, we know we should be winning because we know this winning ground. That is what you do during prep time. And that is it. Thank you for listening, everyone. I hope that was helpful. Yep.
Thank you so much, Jeju, for your presentation and your lecture. So we're going to be moving on to the next part of the workshop, which is the judging workshop. And I think Yoon-chan from the CAPA is going to be leading this part of the workshop. And hello, Jisung.
Actually, I'll be doing the intro.
Okay, that's great.
So yeah. So let me get my lighting better. Okay. Hello everyone. Hello Jisung. So yeah, this part is going to be a 1-hour lecture on adjudication by Jisung. I'm pretty sure Jisung needs no introduction. He's been around KIDA for a very, very long time. He's on, among other things, he's a world universities debating championship breaking adjudicator. He's broken as a debater in Korea multiple times, even in abroad tournaments. Also as an adjudicator, he has numerous achievements all around Asia and even elsewhere. So yeah, without further ado, I give the floor to Jisung, and after this lecture, we will be having the debate watching portion and then the judge like hands-on, like working training session with CP people. Anyways, go ahead. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Hi guys. So can you guys see the screen? Great. I'm assuming you guys can. If you guys can't, now's your time to talk.
It's all good.
Wait a sec. Maybe did it start it right? Oh no. Okay. Spoiler alert. Okay, sure. So, hi guys. I'll be taking care of the Edge workshop for this SNUDA KNC 2021. I was told by Hewon to make this as basic as possible. So I tried to do that, but mind you, I'm not the best at basic Edge lectures. So I've been told. So, and nevertheless, I'll try my best. Okay. So, this slide right here would be a slide of the table of contents. So regarding the basics, I guess there are 4 steps to an adjudication, right? You basically take notes, of course. So that will be the first part I'll be talking about. Second will be about preparing in a way after all the debaters have either left the room or muted their mics and like you're there with your panels. The fellow members of your panels, and you have to discuss and like you have to think about your stuff. So that will be the second step. The third step will be about actually giving the away. And the fourth step would be about individual feedback, which I won't focus on too much because so there are cases where people ask you for individual feedback, but there are also a lot of cases where they don't. So kind of circumstantial. Okay. After that though, we'll be covering 4, I guess, the hard parts about adjudicating, majorly first, explaining the sufficiency or the insufficiency of certain arguments, be it mechanistic arguments or principle arguments or utilitarian arguments, etc. Second part, and this is a classic one, how to evaluate good speech materials. This is always a controversial topic, even amongst adjudicators. Third is about being comparative, and judges also have to be very comparative. So the common thing that is said about adjudication, at least to adjudicators in the beginning state of adjudicating, is try to think like a whip speaker. Meaning, I'm trying to be like a very unbiased whip speaker that looks at both sides' materials from an unbiased yet very comparative perspective. I'll try to go through what I mean by this, like as I go through my stuff. The fourth part is giving the benefit of the doubt, and as much as judges do give benefits of the doubt and are sometimes lenient in interpreting certain arguments, they're not necessarily equally lenient to both sides. So I'll be talking about how you're supposed to be giving the equal benefit of the doubt to both sides and how you can actually do that. Okay, so the first part. Why isn't the slide? Right, note taking. So I guess there are 5 things that you would have to consider when you're taking notes. The first would be worldview, framework. I think Edu did a great job of explaining what the framework is, so I'll kind of like skip that part. Second part would be problem identification. And this is where, like, if you look at the right side here, I said when like taking notes on the problem, try to divide the main problem and sub problem, because it's usually the case that debaters try to have a lot of stuff on their plate, sometimes more than they can really handle. So they end up bringing like so many problems at the same time that they want to solve with one specific model when they actually can't, despite that they actually do. In which case, of course, as Edu stated, there are the level of emphasis, or I guess the level of importance between the argumentations and between the problems that a side tries to solve are very, very different. That's why it's pretty important for the judge to divide the main problem that this side is trying to solve and the sub-problems that this side is trying to solve. Because if this distinguishment goes wrong, then there will be situations where the judge believes that the main problem has not been solved, but at the same time, the team that was evaluated by the judge sincerely believes that they solved the other problem, which, according to their view, was the main problem, right? So that being said, moving on, third principle, this shouldn't be that hard. It's relatively obvious. Solution and mechanism. And here I said, if you look at number 3 on the right side, I said, you're supposed to divide the logical steps. So usually Debaters don't provide mechanisms by steps, like as in they don't say this is the first step, this is the second step, this is the third step. They're not very explicit about the logical steps necessary in order to actualize their ultimate value that they want to achieve at the end of the day. So it's a job for, in that case, it's a job for adjudicators to divide steps. And this is very important because this helps you analyze what logical leaps debaters are making between the steps that they take to make their mechanism work. That's why, and this is also important because you also in the end have to compare the degree of logical leaps aside made in their mechanism versus the degree of logical leaps aside made in their mechanism. So you have to compare that between the two teams. And like this dividing of the steps will certainly help you in that process. And finally, the flow, the logical exchange. So here I wrote flow equals ping pong. So basically what I mean by ping pong is just there is no definitive structure on how you're supposed to take down notes, but make it so that you can clearly see what rebuttals are attacking what argument and what the responses are attacking what rebuttals. So like just, I don't care what style of note-taking you guys end up with. It's just that you have to make it very clearly available on the notes. Like when you look at the notes, of course, you have to make it so that you can see what kind of arguments and what kind of rebuttals were suggested against what points and what the other side stated against those very rebuttals and how those rebuttals were also refuted as well. Because it's going to help you track down whether there was a response to a certain argument and what kind of responses there were to a certain argument. Okay, I was gonna take a picture of my own debate notes, but it turned out to be too messy, so I'm not gonna share it today. But yeah, so let's hope that you guys are good at this part. Great. So again, so OA prep. So remember how I said you're supposed to think like a web speaker? So this is where I guess this is kind of relevant. Okay, so if you don't have your own unique style of adjudicating. And by the way, I don't personally follow the style, but this style is, I guess, one of the most recommended styles for adjudicators. Try to identify the debate according to clash points. And yes, I do understand that in certain cases, the debate won't have clash points because the debate will be very parallel. In that case, what you do is try to identify and divide the debate into three or two, most likely three key issues that the debaters talk about, but maybe don't directly clash against each other on. Okay, so either it be clash points or bulks of issues that debaters talk about. Try to divide the debate into three major bulks or I guess clash points that exist, and then try to identify the logical exchange within each of the clash points. Okay, what I mean by the logical exchange would be to identify the logical ping pong that happened, and by logical ping pong I mean what kind of rebuttals were suggested against what argument, what kind of rebuttals were suggested against those rebuttals that countered the argument, and in the end, what points were answered and what points were unanswered. Try to identify that because the element of unansweredness is going to help you a lot in giving a side a loss and giving a side a win. Okay, it's one of the most convenient justifications to say, hey, you guys didn't respond back to this argument / rebuttals. It was a pretty important argument. That's why I think you guys lose. Okay, so again, I personally don't like this way of adjudicating, but perhaps I guess this is the most convenient, or perhaps the most, I guess, intuitive and clear way of adjudicating, right? Then justify the win-loss of the clash. I kind of explained this right now. You can respond in multiple ways, and I'll actually be covering how you're supposed to justify the win and loss of clashes later on in the part where I explain how you're supposed to explain the sufficiency / insufficiency of arguments. So let's scrap that. Okay. So 4, repeat 1 to 3 with every existing clash in the debate. If possible, try to include some constructive feedback in the beginning as well. I wrote F, it's not bug, it's F. So what I mean by I guess intuitions and perhaps the view of the debate is before you move on into justifying the win-loss of the sides, it's always nice to tell the debaters on a more constructive note how the debate could have improved, what kind of frameworks and what kind of additional materials could have been added to the debate. Because A, if you try to give constructive feedback after the win and loss, debaters won't listen to you because either they're kind of pissed off, or they're too exhausted to continue listening. Okay, so I'm not saying you should like go on and on with this constructive feedback. Just provide a brief insight and perhaps an additional insight on how the debate could have been expanded. Okay, like if, and by the way, when I mean constructive feedback, I don't mean repeating stuff that the debaters already said and claiming that that's something new. Okay, I've seen a lot of judges do this. Okay, so like I said here, identify the sufficiency of proof. And I guess number 3 on the right side is pretty important. Just because there was no response to a certain argument doesn't mean that that argument deserves automatic credit, especially if that argument simply ended at assertion level and does not have significant evidence to back this. I'm going to re-explain this part as well, don't worry. Just note that just because an argument went unanswered doesn't mean that that argument automatically stands. Because under this kind of logic, opposition would always be able to win over government side, because government side like naturally cannot answer some of the rebuttals that opposition side said, whereas opposition side would still be able to have a tangible amount of materials left that the government side wouldn't be able to engage to, because it's not like government whip can engage against opposition whip, right? So there are sequential issues that kind of make it inevitable that government side actually has an disadvantage in terms of responsiveness, which is why if you just like blindly apply no response equals credit, and government side will end up always losing. Okay, so keep this in mind. Okay, and fourth, if possible, try to engage and analyze the best to worst case scenario comparison. I'll also be talking about this later on, and identify the degree of victory. What I mean by that is, so in a lot of cases, fairly a lot of cases, the debate won't come down to 3 clashes. Maybe the debate comes down to an even number of clashes. So for instance, 2 clashes or maybe 4 clashes. But suppose a situation where one side wins 1 clash and the other side takes 1 clash, right? To which then if each of the sides won 1 clash, they're kind of unsure which side should take the win, right? In that case, what you should do is you need to explain why one side took a more definitive win on 1 clash compared to the other side that took a slightly less definitive win on the other side. Because the degree of victory that each side has on each of the clashes will obviously be different. Like if there are 2 clashes, for instance, one side might have taken an overwhelming win on 1 clash, but might have slightly lost in the other clash. In which case, that side should probably take the win. But mind you, try to keep the number of clashes to an odd number, because people will think that you're intervening if you have 2 clashes and each of the sides win 1 of the clashes, and you give one side the win because you thought that they had a more significant win. Okay, so this is just a tip. And I mean, there are inevitable cases where like there were only 2 bulks of issues, but still try to make it an odd number, guys, and not 1. Like the debate can't have 1 clash. That's kind of impossible. Okay, so that being said, right. The third part, giving the away. Okay, so as I stated before, try to start off with a nice impression or a constructive feedback on how the debate could have been expanded. And this kind of works better if you know more than the debaters on a certain topic. You know, like it's optional. You don't have to do this. Second is announce the win and loss. Third, identify the clash points that exist within the debate. Mind you, if you don't want to use clash points, you can use the world comparison mechanism. But again, I don't think comparing worlds would be an available strategy for people just starting adjudication. So just start out with clashes, guys. Okay, and debaters like the clash analysis edging a lot as well. So it's not a downside for you guys. Identify the clash victory and sum up. Give personal feedback if necessary. Now, in the process of adjudication, there are 6, I guess, important parts, if you can see here on the right side. So number 1, don't paraphrase too much. What I mean by that is don't dumb down the arguments to an extent where debaters might feel, hey, you didn't listen to my arguments. And by that, what I mean is, in a lot of cases, judges paraphrase what the debater said in their own words and leave out a lot of the details in the process of portraying that argument. But if you do that from the debater's perspective, the debaters will feel that you weren't listening to their speeches, or you guys left the vital nuance that they were trying to get through at the end of the day. Okay? So, like, try to if possible, try to quote the debaters word by word on what they actually said. If you have the handwriting speed that will allow you, or the typing speed that will allow you to write down each and every word that the debater said. I used to do that, but I'm too lazy now these days. Try to portray the arguments by using the exact words that the debaters used if possible. And if that is impossible, try to be as specific as possible in portraying it. Number one. Number two, this is also important as well. Provide a lot of even ifs as well. Leave out the benefit of the doubt part. I'm going to talk about that later. Try to use a lot of even ifs in your judging, because there are cases where debaters will definitely not like your justification. So what I'm saying is, just have a safety justification in case your first justification doesn't work. So so if you're adjudicating, for instance, the way you would say it is, so number one, this is my adjudication and my reason for giving you guys a loss on this clash. But even if you guys believe that this reason is an intervention, and even if you guys believe that this justification is bad, because of the other justification that I have, you guys still would not be able to take this clash. So prepare a lot of safety justifications just in case your justification doesn't work. Try to make it in an even if format so that even if some of the debaters believe some parts of your justification are kind of, biased and interventionist at certain points, you have safety guards to make sure that there are other reasons as well. Number three, try to judge from the losing team's view, and I see this problem a lot from beginning stage adjudicators. Please do not over-explain the winning side's arguments, because the winning side probably won't even care about that, about that portrayal, because likely they're already happy that they won. Okay, come on, they're already reasonably happy that they won, and they'll probably give you a reasonably okay score, even if they're not given the most specific portrayal. Okay. However, the losing side will definitely be pissed if they're not given an equal amount of portrayal. Okay, so I said this on number 5 as well. Try to give an equal amount of portrayal to both the losing side and the winning side. Okay, be equally specific in portraying them, because it's very easy. It's very easy for the adjudicator to over specifically explain the winning side while not specifically explaining the losing side, because ultimately you gave the winning side the win because you bought a lot more of their arguments than the losing side. And if you buy more of the winning side's arguments, then it is likely that you will have a more specific understanding about the winning side's arguments. That's why you naturally end up being more specific in your portrayal of the winning side's arguments. And I understand that. But that's why you need to constantly remind yourself and counterbalance yourself by telling yourself you need to be especially more specific in portraying the losing side's arguments. Okay, and that's why when I give it my adjudication, 60 to 70% of my adjudication kind of focuses on portraying the losing side arguments. I don't do a lot of portrayal on the winning side arguments. Okay. So number 4, identify the positives and contributions. I said it in fancy vocabulary. This basically means don't overly diss the losing side. Identify the good stuff that they've done as well. Okay, they're gonna hate it if you constantly diss them for something that they didn't constantly diss them for things that they could have done that didn't. And I've been docked too many judge scores to learn this lesson. I've learned this lesson the hard way. So yeah, guys, try to be positive. Also, explain attempts. What I mean by explain attempts means, so obviously there are cases, especially for the losing side, where they try to prove a point, but they end up not being able to sufficiently prove that point, okay? And then in that case, as an adjudicator, don't just simply say, you guys didn't prove this point. At least explain to the degree that they were able to explain. So for instance, you guys proved up to this point, but you guys didn't prove the end goal that you guys were trying to prove. So try to format your explanations in a way where you're explaining that, losing side, you did not prove fully what you were trying to prove, but you did prove up to this extent. But proving up to this extent is simply not enough to prove to the level that you were trying to portray, okay? And now when you guys do this, try to make it so that you guys are not imposing a burden of proof on the side that you're saying didn't prove their argument sufficiently, okay? try to nuance it so that you're simply pointing out that these kind of additional proofs were necessary in order for you guys to reach your end goal of proving a certain point, yet you didn't have these components, yet you didn't have these components. And number two, and try to have safety mechanisms here as well. Try to prove why, even if the side was able to fully prove this point, why they still would not have won the clash/logical exchange. Okay, so like I said, have a lot of even ifs for your adjudication justifications, the same way you would present even if cases in a debate, and explain the attempts to prove something in a more specific way. And by more specific, try to portray to what degree they were actually able to prove. Okay, so let's move on. I have a lot to cover. Okay, so individual feedback, again, like I'm not going to focus too much on this. If you see on the left side, these 6 things are things that you can do for the speaker when they ask for individual feedback. You can suggest a couple of new arguments that they could have used, or an alternate framework / premise that they could have operated under. And if possible, if you in your justification process of giving the win and loss, like in the process of you justifying the win and loss, you might have identified some missing linkages within team's mechanisms. In that case, you guys can fill in the missing links within the logical steps of the mechanisms. Okay, that's the 3rd thing you guys can do. 4th is world comparison. Scrap that. Like maybe you guys can't do that. 5, they're going to ask you a lot for role fulfillment feedback, as in they're going to ask what I could have done as a specific speaker role. So as a deputy, what I can do. As a PM, what I could have done. In that case, yeah, so fill them in on what you could have done as a specific speaker. And 6, this is also quite important, speech structure and organization. Just tip them off on how they could have structured and organized their speech in a more appealing way for the judge to understand. A more coherent way for the judge to understand. Okay, so again, I wrote here the first part. I wrote alternate case construction, optional but positive. So again, this is definitely not a duty of judges, but it's always nice for you to be able to propose an alternate case that the losing side could have run in order to win the debate, because it's going to add a lot of degree of credibility to your adjudication. Because honestly, we all don't want to be adjudicated by a person that kind of sucks more in debating than we are. Okay, like I know this is something that you're not supposed to feel, but every debater kind of naturally ends up feeling that I don't want to be adjudicated by somebody that's not as good as debating than I am. In that case, proposing an alternate case if possible will help you do this. And number 2, focus on how the losing side could have won the debate. What kind of elements could have been added to the losing side speeches so that they could have won the debate. That's why, in terms of personal feedback, try to prioritize the losing side as well here. And the winning side will most likely understand because they're happy that they won the debate. Okay? And finally, don't stop at pointing out the faults of the debaters. And this doesn't apply just to the individual feedback. This kind of applies to the general OA as well. Don't stop at pointing out the faults of the speakers. Try to compare what the other side did better in that aspect. So for instance, if you're identifying that the losing side, for instance, was faulty in these kind of areas, then explain how the winning side did that relatively better. Okay? And I'm going to explain this later on as well in the being comparative part. But yeah, this is how you would do the individual feedback. Right. So explaining sufficiency. Now, so this is the second part of my Edge lecture, which will be about like considering tricky problems. Okay. So there are a lot of cases where you have to compare the impacts of arguments that were provided by the speakers, and you have to be able to explain in that case why one side's argument under the same bulk of issues / clashes over impacts the impact of the other side that kind of lost this logical exchange. In that case, what you do is try to, try to, number 1, see the directness of the response. What I mean by that is there are cases where the debater proposes a rebuttal against the other side. Yet this rebuttal, although very, very substantial in content, does not directly answer or directly negate a given point that was provided by the speakers. In that case, you would give this argument / rebuttal less impact by saying, although this argument was substantial in impact and persuasiveness, this doesn't answer the initial question and problem that was proposed by the winning side, which was A, B, and C. Okay? So that will be first, the directness of the response. Second is general applicability and circumstantial differences. What I mean by that is there are a lot of cases where debaters try to impact their arguments with examples. They try to say, hey, look at this example. My logic applied well for this example, so therefore this logic should hold for other examples as well. But in a lot of cases when debaters do this, they fail to explain why this logic will apply to other examples, meaning they fail to explain why this form of logic applies to this example and will be applied to the equal extent to other examples as well. And this is likely not true, right? Because likely the debaters choose examples that tailor fit their logical arguments, right? That's why this argument and logic won't apply as well to other existing examples. So point that out. And it's best if, of course, the winning side pointed this out against the losing sides in their rebuttals, okay? And tell the debaters, in this case, I couldn't give full credit to your argument because I was not given logical proof as to why this logic will be applied to the general cases and not just the examples that you provided, okay? Third is missing causal linkages. Remember how I talked about how judges are supposed to divide steps of the mechanisms for the debaters if the debaters don't do this so that they are able to see if there are logical leaps between the steps of the mechanisms. So this is what I'm talking about, as in you identify that there was a missing causal linkage, meaning that this logical progression doesn't mean that this end consequence will happen, and this end consequence not happening, therefore, will mean that the ultimate goal that you guys were trying to pursue won't happen. So identify the missing logical linkages between the mechanistic processes, okay? Fourth is on unproven premises and frameworks. So in a lot of cases, debaters will have arguments that make sense in a circular sense, but don't really have a proven premise that it stands on. So for instance, okay, fine. I'll try to think of an example later if possible. The point being, there are certain conditions, usually there are certain logical conditions and logical proofs that needs to be proven if a certain form of argumentation is to make sense. In that case, you give less credit to the team's arguments based on the idea that the premise of that argument and the underlying framework of that argument has not been proven. Finally, it's the lack of probability analysis. What I mean by that is, Yeju kind of did talk about this earlier on regarding the probability of a certain scenario happening. So obviously, if there is policy A and there is a debate about whether policy A should be passed or not, there are multiple possible scenarios that policy A can possibly create, right? But usually, what debaters do is they usually focus on one possible scenario and they neglect the other possible scenarios that may happen. In this case, what debaters should have done is they should have explained why the scenario that they think will happen is the most likely scenario compared to other possible scenarios that will happen due to the implementation of policy A. In that case, you are able to explain to the debater, hey, we couldn't give you, the panel couldn't give you full credit for your argumentations because your arguments are based upon a certain case scenario alpha happening. But you didn't prove why case scenario alpha happening has the highest probability compared to other case scenarios happening, which is why, to a large extent, your arguments end at an assumption level, okay? So like this, try to analyze and explain the fact that the probability analysis, the probability that a side's specific case scenario will or not happen has not been proven, okay? Again here, there are three things that I wrote down here. Try to be very careful and specific in your portrayal of the side's arguments, and like especially, this is the most precarious part about judging, because when you're discrediting or giving less credit to a certain side's arguments, based on what you wrote down and took down on your notes, people will be very, very scrutinizing about what you actually have on your notes because they feel that you didn't keep specific enough notes and therefore some of their arguments and nuances were discredited when they shouldn't have been. Try to be as specific in portraying this as possible. Second, and this is pretty important, explicitly distinguish what debaters think they said and what they actually said. Because in a lot of cases, debaters think that so much more of the points that they were trying to prove were implied in the things that they say. So if, for instance, they think that 10 was said, then they think that 20 was implied. So as a judge, it's your job to distinguish what was clearly said word by word from the debaters and explain why it's not your job to imply for the debaters what they think should have been implied. Because if the judges start implying what the debaters want the judges to imply for them, then there will obviously be differences in the level of how much the judge will imply for each side. Because a judge is naturally biased in his or her own ways, right? So therefore, the level of persuasiveness for each argument will be different. That's why, right, the degree to which the judge will be able to understand the implied things between arguments will be different for both sides. That's why it's always important that debaters spell things out for the judges. Although, yeah, sure, like judges, I guess, should be given some lenience in understanding the nuance of certain points. So identify what the debaters said, what debaters might want the judges to understand is implied, and explain why a certain point does not necessarily imply the point that debaters want. Third is careful note-taking. It's definitely better if you can quote key sentences, okay? And by the way, regarding number 2, maybe some of you guys think that I'm being overly, I guess, strict in my interpretation of, I guess, what I should credit, what a judge should credit amongst what the debater said. So in that case, as I said before, try to be more explanatory on what the debaters want implied and how what the debaters said doesn't necessarily prove what they want implied. Okay, so that being said, moving on. Oh, I don't have that much time. Okay, so evaluating whip speakers, okay? So number 1, again, like whip speakers by debate rules definitely are not allowed to bring constructive material. And by the WUDC Judge Guiding Handbook, it says totally new consequences, new justifications, new moral perspectives, and points that may completely change the direction of the previous case provided by the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister cases should not be considered in the whip speakers, okay? And number 2, try to check the level of direct engagement. And number 3, look at the possibility of preemption. So try to understand number 2 and number 3 together. What I mean by number 2 and number 3 together is this. There are probably points that, so for instance, let's consider a situation where government side provided a certain point. An opposition side from the opposition whip speaker start bringing a totally new rebuttal. And yes, it's a rebuttal, but to a large extent, this rebuttal is also very, very constructive. And therefore, you're not really sure whether that point is a rebuttal or an argument. In that case, what you should do is try to examine what the government whip speaker said and try to find some materials that might have preemptively engaged with some elements of the newly presented argument / rebuttal that you're not really sure of, okay? Because there are a lot of cases where previous materials of previous speakers kind of, to a certain extent, implicitly or explicitly, kind of engage to the new material that is stated by the opposition whip, okay? So in that case, be especially lenient on the implications in like, assessing the engagements against the opposition whip speaker, okay? And here, I know that I said earlier that you're not supposed to be overly lenient. Oh, wait a second. Overly lenient, but again, what I wrote here, and I believe this is true, is you're supposed to be lenient to the preemptive arguments that could have existed because this counterbalances the lack of opportunities to engage. As there's just no way for the government side to really refute opposition whip speaker, right? Because there are no constructive speeches left. To which, if as I said in number 4, if the opposition whip didn't get any POIs and the opposition is sprouting so many new rebuttals that are constructive at the same time, and you are not lenient about government materials that may directly or indirectly and preemptively engage with these new rebuttals, then the government side will definitely feel that you guys are being unfair. So in this specific exception, please be lenient with materials that may implicitly and preemptively collide with the whipped point, and try explaining why even without the whipped material, one side still wins. Okay, like as a safety mechanism. Like I can't emphasize this enough. Prepare a lot of even ifs for your justifications. Okay, and number 4, did the whip accept a lot of POIs? This is actually a pretty important factor. When I judged at Worlds, a lot of the most renowned judges use this as a standard of crediting / discrediting whip speaker materials, etc., etc. So I guess this is a relevant standard. Okay. Okay. And number 3, and this I think is the most important thing in lecture thingamajiggy that I'm doing right now. This is about being comparative. There are 2 things to remember in being comparative. Of course, there might be more, but I think there are 2 very important things. Number 1, never stop at simply pointing out what a team did wrong. Explain how the other team did better. Okay. And this is especially true for panels that I usually end up judging with in KNC or intra-varsity level tournaments. What they simply do is they simply point out the fault of the losing side and say because they were insufficient, they had to lose the debate. This is a bad justification because if the winning side equally sucked, then the winning side should not be winning as well, right? So be comparative, okay? But number 2, and I guess this is the more important part, explain how the other team did better under the same standards. What I mean by that is, so in this, let's go back to that case where I asked the panel why he or she thought that side won, and the panel simply states the other side was not very, very developed in their arguments, that's why they lose. And then I re-asked them kind of by saying, but then let's try to be a bit more comparative. Can you prove what the winning side did better? In that case, what they usually do is they apply different standards on evaluating both sides. So for instance, what they do is they explain how the losing side did not do a good job of developing their arguments, but when I ask them to be comparative, they explain why the winning side did a better job of rebutting or refuting the losing side arguments. But if you think about it, you're applying different standards and evaluating the losing side and the winning side based on different standards, right? You're giving a side the win under the basis that they gave good rebuttals, but you're giving the losing side the loss under the basis that they had bad arguments, right? But from the debater's perspective, this is not going to look very comparative. So what you have to do is, if you're going to blame a side for having bad arguments, then you need to prove why the winning side had good arguments, right? If you're going to penalize a side, if you're going to give a side a win for having good rebuttals, you need to be able to prove why the losing side had bad rebuttals, right? So analyze the sides and compare the sides based on the same standards. And what I mean by, and I kind of oversimplified it with just rebuttals and the development of arguments. This can be a bit more specific as well. So compare, when you're saying that the side, for instance, has a lack of mechanism on how they're going to actualize their ultimate value / ultimate goal, then prove why the losing side, then prove why the winning side had a significantly or notably better mechanism, and prove how the winning side had best logical leaps in between their mechanisms. Okay, so make sure that you compare the sides each under same standards and same metrics of adjudication, instead of applying different standards upon sides and simply saying, guys sucked at A and they did better in B. You need to be able to say, the losing side sucked at standard A, while the winning side did a better job at standard A. Okay. That being said, moving on to the benefit of the doubt. Okay, so right. So you're supposed to give the equal benefit of the doubt to both teams. Okay? What I mean by that, and by the way, what I mean by that is you're supposed to first off exclude personal intuitions in this process. And mind you, there are cases where a certain side will be forced to argue for a value that does not fit the judge's personal, I guess, belief systems. So for instance, let's say that the debate was about corporate social responsibility. And one side starts arguing how society, corporations have the duty and responsibility to give back to society, whereas the other side runs along the arguments of the corporations are just there to simply earn profit. They're not trying to do society any harm, and that corporations, by their very existence, serve society. Therefore, they should not bear social responsibility, right? Considering how KIDA is liberal biased, most likely a lot of the judges will believe in the former side in terms of their personal intuitions, right? First off, you need to be equally willing to believe that corporations are just there for reaping profits without causing third-party harm, and that their very existence contributes to society, therefore they don't have an obligation. Even if you are a liberal, for instance, and there is a conservative line of logic going on, you need to be willing to believe it. The opposite kind of stance as well. So for instance, if you're a conservative judge, you need to be equally willing to believe in the liberal version and liberal interpretation of society as well. But I'm not talking just in terms of liberal/conservative biases. What I'm saying is that, like, there are just certain belief systems and certain value systems that a judge is more prone to believe in. Constantly remind yourself that you need to be equally open to other belief systems as well. But not just in terms of the direction of the beliefs, this also has to do with giving the equal benefit of the doubt for resources and possibility. So what I mean by this is there was a SNUDA IV grand final motion in 2019. The motion was assuming, and actually Haewon was judging with me. Haewon is here. Hi. So the motion was, under the veil of ignorance, this house would choose to live under a socialist world as opposed to a capitalist world / status quo. Okay? So there was a situation where the government side was arguing that under a socialist world, governments would have the resources and they would be a lot more willing to distribute these resources more equally. Therefore, more people would be able to enjoy basic welfare. That was the government side's argument for, like, proposing that we should stay in a socialist world rather than a capitalist world if we're under the veil of ignorance. The opposition side's arguments to this, and the counter argument was, even under a capitalistic world, welfare systems are possible. Now here, opposition side's arguments were largely discredited by a lot of the judges because like, to a large extent, yeah, it's, I guess, a lot more intuitive that under a socialist world, you would have more incentives to, I guess, distribute resources in a more equal manner. But what I'm saying here is, regarding the benefit of the doubt, you also need to give opposition side the benefit of the doubt that selective welfare is possible. Because under the fiat rule, government side and opposition side are have the same access to the same amount of resources, right? To which then, if you're arguing that, if government side is able to argue that a socialist government has enough resources to distribute to the people, say about $100 million to distribute to the people, and you need to be able to equally assume for the opposition side that they have $100 million to distribute as means of selective welfare. Okay? That is why, in terms of the resources and the possibility of this distribution happening, you should be able to see the flip side, where the side that perhaps might not have the best edge in welfare or equitability in terms of distribution might also be and have equal access to the same amount of resources as well. So I wrote two things here on the right side. First, what I said earlier, this kind of coincides with what I said earlier. Distinguish assertions and arguments. And what I mean by distinguishing assertions and arguments is, I didn't specify here, is this. So remember how I talked about how there can be multiple case scenarios that may happen due to the existence or implementation of policy A. Let me kind of change that to a regrets motion, right? So let's say that there's this house, this was a debate that happened in a YU session a couple of days back. The motion was, wait a sec, let me remember. This house regrets. Oh, okay. So this house regrets the emphasis on you know what? Actually, let's just use the example right here. So the motion example I wrote here was, this house prefers a narrative that emphasizes individual efforts and success, right? So let's kind of flip this and say, this house regrets the societal emphasis on meritocracy and personal efforts and success. Okay, so let's say that there's this motion. In this motion, there are multiple possible scenarios that would have happened if we didn't have the narrative that glorifies meritocracy and personal efforts in achieving success, right? And here, likely aside, well, in a lot of cases, what the debaters will do is they're going to assume that a certain case scenario will happen without explaining why this case scenario will be more probable than the other case scenarios that will happen, okay? So remember how I talked about the probability analysis, how debaters are supposed to provide an analysis as to how and why their scenario will most likely be probable. Like this is kind of linked to what I said about that. So let's say, for instance, okay, so actually number 2 kind of explains this better. So let's say that there's this motion. This house prefers a narrative that emphasizes individual efforts and success. Let's say that opposition stated, like, if we only blame individuals, like the status quo, if we only blame individuals and their efforts in success instead of the rigid, and people will only end up blaming individuals instead of the rigid discriminatory social structures that may prevent individuals from achieving success. This is a popular argument in this debate, right? But this, if you think about it, is only one of the possible scenarios that may happen if this narrative does exist, right? So what I'm saying is, this in and of itself is not an argument, it's an assertion, unless there are evidences to prove that this scenario will most specifically happen. That is why, if, for instance, opposition states that if we prefer a narrative that emphasizes individual efforts and success, then we'll only end up blaming individuals instead of the rigid social structures that may prevent individuals from succeeding. And you need to equally believe in the flip side, and if this narrative doesn't exist, then people will end up only blaming society instead of individual efforts, which is also a scenario that is not encourageable, right? Because think about it. If opposition's logic is we're only going to blame individuals if this narrative didn't exist, then the flip side of that is if this narrative exists, then if this narrative doesn't exist, people will only blame society instead of blaming their own individual efforts, right? So then if you're equally willing to believe in the flip side, then unless one side proves that their version of the status quo or their version of reality is more likely to be true than the flip side, then no one's really winning this clash. I guess this is a difficult concept to digest at first, and maybe you guys won't be able to apply this right away in adjudications right now, but try to. So what I'm saying, the essence of what I'm trying to say here is, unless there is significant enough proof that an assertion is not simply an assertion, and you need to believe the exact opposite of that assertion as well, to which then you can't give full credit to that assertion, okay? So I was running through, I guess this kind of does conclude what I prepared for the lecture. Again, I did have a lot more to say. It's just that like I was rushing through because if I focus too much upon a certain topic by giving you examples of certain debates and like stuff like that, then I would have needed 2 hours, trust me. So yeah, this kind of concludes what I was trying to get through to you guys. So in the end, if you're going to, like, I understand like you guys won't be able to take everything that I've mentioned. If you guys have trouble with that, then at least try to take the part where I said here, like, don't stop at simply pointing out what a team did wrong. Try to be as comparative as possible in providing and preparing the OA, and think like a whip speaker. I guess that's the underlying thing that I was trying to explain. And yeah, if you could keep what I said, that would be great. So yeah, that kind of concludes my lecture. Thanks guys for listening.